Hey everyone, so this is the second exercise walkthrough video I'm recording today. Now I want to take a look at useState a lot more and break that down some more. This isn't necessarily exercises to work through, just examples. I have this one currently is the one without helper text so that you don't have to read a gazillion lines of code while I'm talking through it, but there is another React useState example in my CodePen that has a lot more text that kind of is going to go over everything we're about to talk about. First things first in here, this is normally how a CodePen works when you open it up. Actually, it would look more like this, but I've already started pulling things away. But because we want to take a look at this and the code, I think it might be better to do something like this. And then I can pull this out. And so now we can see the changes live and we can see the code really well. So that's just an option for you if you decide to play around in CodePen. So overall, this useState example, we have two examples. We have an app component, which we are rendering into the actual DOM with the div called root. If we open that up, we can see that in the HTML. There it is. And inside the app component, we are returning just an overall div to contain it. And then the first example component in a second. And we're not passing any props into it. We're just focusing on state today. So we have example 2 here, which I'm going to close for right now. And we're going to go up to example 1. And this is the same component that we are rendering down here. Do want to point out that normally we wouldn't need to do this type of line. We wouldn't have to destructure useState and other hooks from the React object we're getting, but CodePen, which I actually had to set this up earlier, and I can show that at the end how I set this up, but CodePen doesn't let you import like parts of a library like we would with useState. So the alternative to this was having to like write react.useState every time, which looks a little weird, and it also doesn't match how we're doing it, and I didn't want to confuse anyone. So that's why this line is in here. So we've got this first component here, example 1, and we have useState being run here to create the variable switch is on. And then you see we are also creating its setter method, which is going to set the value of switches on whenever we call it. We're going to change the value. And then when we're calling useState, we're passing an initial value of false. But let's break this down a bit more about what's happening in this line, because even though it is so small, there is so much happening here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to console, actually, so let's take a look at this line down here, because we're not destructuring example state array. We're just assigning the entire array we're getting from useState, and we're to example state array. So we're going to console log this to see what we're going to get. Console log. And then I have this on update by itself mode, which I might change in a second, but okay. So you see we have an object here with two, I'm sorry, we have an array here. All arrays are objects technically, but all arrays, so we have, backtrack. So we have an array here with 2 elements. And the first element is the initial value that we passed into this useState test. And the second one is a function. And your console's not going to write out the entire function for you. We don't need to worry about it. But what we do need to know is that what this function is doing is it will update the first value to whatever we pass in here. So that is what's happening in useState. useState is returning an array with 2 elements. And the reason it's returning an array of 2 elements rather than like 2 separate elements is that that's not possible in JavaScript, is to return more than 1 element. So we get around that by returning an array. And then we're using JavaScript destructuring up here in this line to immediately assign the different values of these 2 elements. So in this useState, switches on is going to immediately get false, and set switches on is going to get that setter function that's going to update switches on. These lines down here are just the longer way to get to this. So yeah, we're creating this array, and then I'm creating the example state, which will take test because it's the first element, and then set example state, which will take the second element, and then we'll get the function. So let's console log those as well. Console log example state and console log set example state. And I'm going to turn off the auto run because it's bothering me. So we'll go over to settings and we'll go to behavior, and we're going to turn off. And I'll do format and save. Okay. All right, so I'm going to clear you and then we'll rerun. So that way we don't have this constant mix of confusion and bugs and errors as I'm in the middle of typing. So the first console log is the entire array we're getting back from useState. And then the second one is the first element of that array. So you can see it's getting the value of test. That's what we're passing in to be the initial value. And then the second variable, the third console log, is this the setter method that will then update example state. So we can do like set example state will now be hello world. And then I actually, if I console log example state again, I think we will still see test due to the way that React updates state. It's going to wait until, actually, I would cause an infinite loop is what I would cause because we're not even inside of a function currently. Well, we're inside the main function. And so as we know, state causes a re-render. So if I were to change set example state right now, which if we run, we should see an infinite loop happen. And there it goes. And I think it just, yeah, I think it killed it just because there's some logic in place to prevent a permanent infinite loop that will probably hurt the performance of your computer or the site. So the reason that's happening is because every time I update example state, it causes a re-render, which then causes all of these lines to be run again, which then this state will get updated again, and it'll just keep going and going and going and going. So that's why that is happening. But you can see we are getting hello world after we get test. So that set is working. It's just we shouldn't be doing it in here. So we don't actually need any of these pieces of state. That's just for example. So I'm going to remove it. And again, switches on is going to get that false. So let's just witness that one more time. We'll see switch is on. and then what set switch is on is getting assigned to. And it's getting assigned to false and to this function. Let me clear that and also show again, just because that was confusing by not clearing it ahead of time. So yeah, the first one is false. And the second console log is just that setter function. We can see it's a function. We know it's a setter function, but the console just tells us it is a function. So that is how state is being created. Let's skip this for now because we're not even rendering that yet. So let's get down to what's being rendered. In the return of this example one component, we're returning a div with a couple of class names so that we can style it. We have the big example one, and then we have a button that has an on-click property, and that is pointing to this function right up here. But before we take a look at that, we'll also see the label inside is switch is, and then we're using some logic in here, which is why we have our curly braces. I actually don't know why this was added. I don't think I added that, but that's not necessary. So we're using the same ternary expression that we were seeing in the arrow functions. So what we're doing is this is a conditional basically. Is switch is on true or is it false? Because switch is on is a Boolean, we can just use its name. You can just call its variable as the conditional. We don't have to do like a switches on equals true. We don't have to do that because it's going to evaluate as true or false because of the data type it is. So switches on true. If it's true, the word that should appear is on. If it's false, the word that should appear is false, which right now, because we initially set the state to false, it says switches off. Okay, so then what happens when we click? When we click, we see it changes to switches on. Because of those console logs, we also are re-rendering the function. I've removed it, but I haven't rerun it, and so the previous code is still kind of in place. So the logic previously is still in there, so we'll keep seeing that in the console. But if let me clear you first, and then press you, we're not going to see that because now it's using the code that the code state as it is. All right. So when we click that button, handle button click is called. So we're going to open that up and take a look. So what I've done here is I wrote out the longer way of updating set switches on. And then we're going to take a look at that, and then we're going to look at the shorter way, which is right down here. So every setter method, we can just pass in the new value like you saw earlier with hello world. But we also could pass in a function, and the function will manipulate some data and return what the new value should be. And what's great about the function option is that we get a parameter that is going to be equal to the value of the state that's being manipulated when its setter method is called. So oftentimes this is called prev whatever, like prev state, prev Boolean, prev string, whatever, because the idea is it represents the state before you've manipulated it at all inside this function. And then what we're just going to do is we're going to return the new value. So in this case, we're getting that prev state parameter, which we know before when we click it originally, right after we've loaded up our app for the first time and it's equal to false, we know prev state is going to be equal to false. So it goes down here and we're going to have a conditional that says, hey, is prev state equal to true? If so, return false, but we know it's not. We know it's currently equal to false, so it's going to fall into that else, and it's going to return true. And so then that gets sent back up to set switches on, and set switches on is going to get the new value of true, which is going to cause a re-render, which then causes switch is to change from off to on. We can see that happen right here. Okay, let me rerun this. So we refresh. So how do we turn this whole thing into that sweet one line we've got down here? First, let's turn it into an arrow function, which we can do by just removing the word function and adding our arrow. And since we have curly brackets, we still could use the return. So this does work currently how it is. I'm also going to remove these parentheses. Both work with or without parentheses if it is only one parameter. If it's 0 or more than 1, you do need the parentheses. And I think there's a couple options here to make this a one-liner. We could do a ternary, like you would do prev state question mark, and if it's, which means it's, you know, like it was with the I guess it was the previous arrow functions we were looking at, like if, oh, it was here. I was like, did we just talk about this? Because prev state is going, we know it's going to be a Boolean. We can just say like, is prev state true or false? That's our conditional. And then we can put false, because if it's currently true, we want to return false. And if it's currently false, we want to return true. So this would work. And let's clear out all of this. Thankfully, we've got these nice little indicators to tell us where the brackets are paired. So everything's looking good. So I can rerun. Okay. And we are seeing the button get switched on and off and on and off and on and off. So we're good. However, there's a way to go even shorter, as you can see in this line down here. Because prev state is just a Boolean, there's only 2 possible states it can be. We can use the exclamation mark, which it means not, to change it to just be like not what it currently is. So I'm going to just turn this, uncomment this out and comment the other one out. So it's basically what's happening here is we're saying whatever the value of prev state is currently, return the opposite of that. That's what the not means, the exclamation mark. So if it's true currently, return false. If it's false currently, return true. And if you remember when we were talking about arrow functions in the previous video, we don't need a return statement here because this is one expression. This is a one expression line, and it's one action. We're just checking what is the previous state and flip the value. And so we don't need our curly brackets and we don't need return, because return is implicitly applied if it's just a single expression. So that's why there's no return statement here. It's just an arrow pointing to not prev state. And let's rerun that again to make sure it's still working. And on, off, on, off, on, off. Yep, we're good to go. So that is how one would update state with prev state. That's just like a Boolean. Okay, and then the other example I did is also pretty straightforward, pretty basic. It's popular with a lot of intro to state tutorials, but I wanted to walk through it again because it is so often found in different articles, but maybe hearing it might be better. I don't know. So this is example 2 we're looking at now. And if we look down at what's being rendered, underneath example 2, we have a button that also, again, has an on-click event that is run when it's clicked. And then the label of the button says this button has been pressed. And then we have logic to show a value times. Right now, what we're seeing is 0, and because because button counter is set to 0. And why is that? It's because we're creating the 2 variables, the 2 state variables needed to operate button counter. We're creating button counter itself, and we're creating the setter method to update button counter. And useState is returning that data for us, and we're just giving names to it by this destructuring. And then useState is also assigning 0 to button counter because that's what we passed in. So I'm gonna go over this one more time too. So there's like 2 sides to equations, right? We've got our left side and our right side. You know, left is going to get equal to what right returns. So the right, even though we normally read left to right, and coding we also read left to right, but in this case it's more useful to start with the right side instead of the left side. So let's look at like what useState is doing. We're calling useState and we're passing in 0. And so what happens is useState does some magic. We don't know exactly what's happening. There's definitely articles out there that like break down literally what's happening in useState and like have you write your own useState function. But what's great about libraries and frameworks in JavaScript is that we don't need to know what's happening in all of these functions. We just need to know what we need to send into it and what we expect to get out of it. Just like when we were learning functions in Unit 1, it's that whole, it's the same exact idea of this is, you're going to send something in, you're going to return something out. You don't need to know what happens inside of it. So useState, we're passing in this value of 0, and it's going to be passing back out this array of 2 elements, which we talked about before. The first element is going to just be whatever you sent in originally, which is it's going to be 0. And the second element is going to be a function to then change this value by passing in another value into that function. And so we have to then call it some names when we get it back. And so we could do like const button state equals useState 0, but what happens is button state is now it's now the array holding both the value and the setter method, which is not very convenient. But we could do this. Like what I could do is we have button counter here. So I would do button state element 0 to replace, you know, the button counter from before. We're just saying like button state, the first element that actually holds the value should be shown here. So if I run this, we should see that. We might get yelled at for set button counter, but I don't think so. Yeah, so the button has been pressed 0 times. We're still getting that. And I could even do button state element 1 to access that setter method. And we're seeing that work. So it does work, but it's just not, it doesn't make any sense. Like, what is button state element 1? Why would that be a function? You know, that doesn't read function to me. So instead, we can use that array destructuring to name the 2 elements the moment they are returned from useState, which we're choosing I chose to call it button counter, and then the setter method is going to be set button counter. Again, you can name the setter method whatever you want. It doesn't have to be set whatever, but it should be, because that's what the common practice is to have set the name of your variable. That's what your teammates are going to be looking for when they look at your code. So that's why it's important to stick with common patterns and practices. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of this, and I'm going to update the state that I just changed to be set button counter again, and button counter over here. And since I made some changes, let's rerun to make sure everything's still working. Yep, everything's still working. So now let's take a look what's happening in this on click method, the handle button counter click. Once again, we are using that prev state that we are getting from the setter method. So set button counter is called, and instead of passing just like a number into it, we're passing in a function to update. So what we could, if the use case calls for it, we could just be like set button counter 1. And so by pressing it, we do get 1. If I keep pressing, it's just going to be at 1 forever, because this is just a static instance. So we don't want that. We want to be updating it every time. So what we're going to do is we pass that function in that's going to return, we're going to manipulate the previous state and return the new state in. So in this instance, we are getting what the previous state is, or really the state that exists when we call set button counter, which when the user first opens up the app, we know it's going to be 0 because they have not interacted with it yet. So this previous state is basically equal to 0 to start with. And then in the arrow function body, we're saying take previous state, add 1 to it, and then return that value. And then that's what's being set to set button counter. And then, so in this case, we know previous state is 0. So we're just adding 1, which is going to be 1, and that's setting back to set button counter. And then button counter is 1, but the user presses the button again. So now prev state is equal to 1, and we're doing 1 plus 1 to send it back. So that is what's happening in this arrow function. We can even, I'm just doing that because it's cleaner. We can even take this out, because this is basically one expression. It's a one expression event handler. We can take this out and put it in here. Now we can't put it in here just like this, because React will see us calling a function in a render and just be like, okay, I'm going to call it now. And I think we'll have an infinite loop. So let's see what happens if I rerun this. I think I will cause an infinite loop. Yeah, it's like, I don't know what to do with this. So what we have to do is we want to do it inline. We need to do yet another arrow function to be like, hey, wait, and call. Basically, the arrow function is saying like, here is the function you will run when the button is clicked. So kind of like we look back at example 1, we have this handle button click happening here, but we don't have the arrow function. And you're like, why is that? That's because we're not actually calling the handle button click here. We're just passing in the, hey, this is the function that will happen when you click it. And we know we're not calling it because there's no parentheses there. But here there are parentheses because we're passing in data. So if you ever have an on click where you need to pass in parameters, and so you have to have those parentheses, then you need to wrap it inside of an arrow function, because the arrow, basically that's the function you're then handing to the on click functionality. You're like, okay, this arrow function that just says, hey, run set button counter should be run when the user clicks. So let's refresh to make sure everything's working. And it is. And we get button is working. Press 14, 15, 16 times. So that is some basic state. In the future, maybe my next plan that I plan on recording is going through the grocery list studio again, because that state was a lot more complex. And we can take a look at state there, and then also passing data up and down. All right. Talk to y'all later.